to record, and let me also start. Well, we are on recording mode, and let me also present my screen so that you can have a look at what I am going to use as my study material. Right. Is my screen visible now? Could any one of you respond?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right. Thank you. Right.
Yes, sir.
So the dates once again, 1809 to 1831, Henry Louis Vivian Derozio. Now, Derozio, interestingly, is born in Kolkata in April 1809. And if you look at the lineage of Derozio, Derozio's father is a Christian Indo-Portuguese office worker. Now, it's interesting to me because, Portuguese were very often Catholic. More often than not, they were Catholic, but Derozio's father, of course, was a Protestant, and his mother was an English woman. Derozio had substantial relations in Scotland. Therefore, there's a certain Scottish connection to Derozio as well, and he refers to Scotland in some of his poems as well. But the point that I would like you to note is that Derozio's identity is Eurasian, in the sense that what we now know as an Anglo-Indian in that sense of the term. Now, the term used at that point of time was Eurasian. So somebody who's born of people who were born in India, as it were, or of mixed birth. But Derozio never really uses the word Eurasian. He instead identifies himself with India and refers to himself as the East Indian. In fact, he started editing a newspaper titled The East Indian, which was dedicated to the cause of the Anglo-Indian community, as it were, in Kolkata and India. Therefore, this identification with India is an interesting aspect in Derozio's poetry. He always refers to himself as an Indian, as an East Indian. Now, the other thing that you need to also notice is his cosmopolitan sympathies. Now, Derozio's time, if you take a quick look at it, 1809, is one of churning in Europe as well, isn't it? 1789, you had the French Revolution, which has fired up the imagination of the Romantics. All of them, if you remember your Butler, Marilyn Butler's book, Romantics, Rebels, and Reactionaries, all of them are fascinated with the idea of revolution, freedom, the abolition of slavery in certain cases, all of which are very important interests for Derozio. The other thing that you need to also locate is, while this revolution is happening in England and spreading across Europe, Derozio is born just 20 years after the revolution has started. India, too, is also witnessing a remarkable shift. And this period, I will say, is the period of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Now, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, of course, if you remember, is born in the 1770s. So this is the time Raja Ram Mohan Roy's selfhood is also coming into formation. Remember that he's traveling to England. He is ecstatic at the fact that the revolution has happened, and he is bringing back many of the aspects of liberal Enlightenment thinking back into India. He's engaging with the Christian missionaries, he's talking about the Unitarianism of the Hindu religion, which will later on lead to the formation of the Brahmo Samaj. His letter to Bentinck is almost on the way, 1823. And his letter to Amherst, and the establishment of the Hindu College is around the corner. Now, This is therefore a time when Europe itself is moving towards a surge for nationalism, and many of you are aware through your graduation course that nationalism as an ideology is deriving from Benedict Anderson's idea of the imagined community formed with print culture, right? With vernacular print culture, regional print cultures. This is also the time when Europe is coming into a nationalist phase, accelerated by the French Revolution. At the same time, the Enlightenment and its what we will call its radical continental perspective. Remember that the Enlightenment did not take place in England alone. It took place across Scotland, Europe, America, and so on and so forth. Therefore, it has a cosmopolitan, global kind of an outreach. And India at this point of time is coming into contact with this cosmopolitan modernity, right? So India's modernity is strangely, almost Janus-faced. That it is, on the one hand, substantially derived from the European and more particularly English Enlightenment. Derozio, in fact, is reading Hume. He's reading Thomas Paine. And remember Hume's skepticism and his refusal to believe in religion, organized religion. He's also reading Tom Paine very carefully, and Tom Paine's ideas of revolution, the renouncing of monarchy and authority, is something which is deeply impacting Derozio. Raja Rammohn Roy, of course, is using this entire discourse of modernity at this point of time to search for a way in which Hindu society can be reformed. And it's strange that on the one hand, he's using Enlightenment ideas, but he's delving into the Vedas and the Hindu scriptural texts to try and find instances where modernity can be introduced, from where modernity can be introduced. My point being, you see, there is the suggestion of an impending, exciting modernity fueled by the Enlightenment and the Romantics. But there is also that modernity which is trying to go back to a rational past of India that is glorious and that has declined due to dogmatism. আমি এটা একটু সহজ করে বলি একবার. Please pardon me, those of you who do not understand Bangla, but this needs to be told to the majority of the class. এই যে আধুনিকতা আমাদের, এই আধুনিকতাটা at this point of time is two-faced. একদিকে ইউরোপীয় এনলাইটেনমেন্ট, Locke, Hume, Rousseau, with a strange impact of reason, a questioning of religion, a movement towards independence, liberty, personal equalities. একদিকে ইংরেজি শিক্ষা এবং ইংরেজি ভাষার মাধ্যমে এটা আমাদের কাছে আসছে। And that is being used by Raja Rammohn Roy. Raja Rammohn Roy ব্যবহার করছেন to question Hindu dogmatism. অর্থাৎ হিন্দু সমাজের মধ্যে বিশেষ করে the treatment of women, education, পৌত্তলিকতা, all these are issues which are being sort of questioned with the coming of modernity and ideas of the West, but they're being done by relying back on the Vedic text. অর্থাৎ রাজা রামমোহন কিন্তু আবার ফিরে যাচ্ছেন শাস্ত্রে দেখতে যে সেখান থেকে কোথাও আমরা can we derive ideas which are Enlightenment modern or modernist through the Enlightenment. অর্থাৎ আধুনিকতার খোঁজ একদিক থেকে যেমন পাশ্চাত্য থেকে আসছে, modernity is coming simultaneously from the West, as well as it is being sought to defined through our ancient texts. And there is this vision of an India which was modern, which was golden, and which has suddenly lost its way into dogmatism. I ask you to remember this, because this is going to be a substantial argument which I'll put forward when I discuss to India, my native land, or the Indian harp. You see, Derozio will be forever looking back at a past golden India and a present India which relies in ruins. But to understand this modernity, we need to take a look, a very careful look, at these ideas which were fueled by the Enlightenment and also accelerated by the Romantics. Most of you who have read the Enlightenment and the Romantic tend to see the 18th century as the age of reason and the Romantics as the age of imagination, and that they are two almost polar opposites. Now, I'm contesting that, because you see, many of the Romantic ideas that you have of sensibility, for example, are taken from Hume. Many of the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, all these ideas are derivatives of the Enlightenment rather than any specific Romantic credo. Obviously, the role of the imagination changes in poetry. Now, the other thing that I would like you to note is that the Romantic creed is bringing in also an idea of the bardic poet, the poet who sings. More importantly, the bardic poet who sings for the nation. If you remember your Shelley, who influenced Derozio very deeply, I think Derozio is impacted by the later Romantics, not Wordsworth and Coleridge so much, but Shelley, Keats, and Byron. There is this idea of the poet as the harp through whom ideas blow and who can disperse them to the people at large. So the poet is, as it were, also a transmitter of ideas, a conduit of ideas to a broader reading public. Now, in Derozio, what I see is a strange coming together of the poet as bard, the poet as prophet. Remember your Shelley, mind is like a fading coal, and the ideas are being dispersed, right? The ideas of the skylark, for example, once again. So the bardic, prophetic poet is conflated, attached with the idea of the teacher who is circulating to a group of students, right? Therefore, Derozio was a teacher extraordinary. He was also trying to take on from Shelley and the Romantics the idea of a prophetic poet who could bring in or usher in change through poetry, right? So Derozio is situated at this cusp, I would say, when India is witnessing major modernist changes, situated at this cusp at a very interesting point of time, placed from a very interesting modernist perspective, right? And his identity as the East Indian, who is neither, British nor fully Hindu or Mohammedan, is providing him with a kind of a vantage point, a kind of a broader perspective through which he can critique both traditions. He can critique the imperialism of the West as well as the dogmatism of the East in certain ways. So he's critical of the British on the one hand, who preach equality but do not practice it. And he's equally critical of especially Hindu civilization or Hindu dogmatism at this point of time, which is denying fundamental rights to many citizens. Right. So this is a study material which I will circulate. Remember that Derozio will go on to teach at Presidency College, uh, not Presidency College, I'm sorry, please forgive me, it's Hindu College at this point of time, which is started with David Hare and a lot of other people coming together to give Hindu students a formal introduction to the Western sciences and Enlightenment ideas. So Western education for Hindu students, Hindu College. Derozio is a young poet who is invited because he's a East Indian. I will use the word East Indian, not Eurasian, not Anglo-Indian, East Indian. He agrees to work there for a pittance, 150 rupees a month. A European professor would get more than double his salary. And you can see him as placed in between, because when Derozio does not submit monthly reports, the principal of the college actually tries to slap him. And he has to withdraw. And then he's thrown out from Presidency College because, Hindu College once again, sorry, because he's circulating ideas which are anti-Hindu, as it were. I'll come to that part in a few moments. So Derozio is in this liminal in-between state. He has this introduction and deep seeping in European culture, at the same time not accepted by the European as part of his culture. He's also an Indian, yet cannot identify with the specifically Hindu or Muslim culture, right? So straddling this world, this liminal space. Now, also remember that when he's asked to recall who the great personalities who had influenced him were, who does he mention? He mentions Bacon, Milton, Locke, Stuart, Shelley, and Newton. Remember, all of these are Enlightenment thinkers. Therefore, the idea of freedom, rationality, and to a certain extent, a question of religion, right? Remember, Locke was the person who was arguing that Christianity is not mysterious. It has to be first explained through rationality. Hume, for example, on his deathbed was asked to announce the presence of God, and he steadfastly refused. So there's this Enlightenment question of religion and dogma that Derozio inherits. The Enlightenment rationality, which tries to spark off in his students. And therefore, he has this idea that Derozio is also not only a poet, but also a teacher from whom a kernel of students will develop. And you will see how Derozio continuously uses this idea of the gardener who is nurturing a garden and who's sort of blooming flowers. And these flowers will later on be the Young Bengal movement. But let me come back, because I'm sort of spreading myself a little too large. But you have to understand the context within which Derozio is operating. Otherwise, why he wrote what he wrote becomes a little hazy for us. Now, his education is also very interesting. 1815 onwards, Derozio is attending David Drummond's Dharamtala Academy. Now, I've modernized the spelling and made it Dharmatala so that you can understand. Now, Drummond School is a very interesting school in the sense. Drummond arrives in Kolkata in 1813, and he starts the school where Indian and European children are taught together. Now, that is to say that Drummond is bringing for the first time the European and the Indian self-formation on the same plane. Now, this would probably not happen later on. It becomes, therefore, one of a kind school where Indian children and European children go especially the East Indian children, are brought to be educated together, and from different classes as well, right? Also important is that Drummond is a skeptic and a free thinker. And it is from Drummond that Derozio has a liberal education into the Enlightenment philosophy, right? Derozio is an extraordinary student in that. He is very good at cricket, incidentally. He's good at acting, he's performing in drama, and he is very good as a public speaker and an orator, especially somebody who can recite English literature. Now, obviously, it is during this time that he's introduced to the poetry of Byron and Shelley and Keats, and they impacted him very deeply. Now, you will, of course, remember why I mentioned Byron, Keats, and Shelley. They were much more impacted by the French Revolution. Ideas of revolutionary zeal, especially when you will look at Shelley's Prometheus Unbound or Byron's poems, you will take a look at the way in which they were taking this new dawn of revolution, personal freedom, free thinking to an extreme, as it were. And both of them, if you remember, all of them, in fact, died in Italy rather than in England. They were so taken up with the continental idea of freedom. Right. And later on, in the last piece of writing that Derozio had, which was published posthumously. In fact, it's very interesting that Derozio, in the last really public act that he did, was act as an examiner for his alma mater. He actually acted as an examiner for Drummond School. He wrote that it is freedom from illiberality. So talking about his own school, as some of the schools in Calcutta, objections are made to native youth, not so much on the part of the masters of the Christian parents who have children at these schools. At the Dharmatala Academy, however, there is none of this illiberal feeling. It's quite delightful to witness the exertions of Hindu and Christian youth striving together in the same classes for academical honors. So Derozio acknowledged the role that Dharmatala Academy played in foisting or festering this bond, the sense of Indianness of the Christians and the Hindus alike. You will remember, of course, that education came a little later to the Muslim students, especially English education came a little later to the Muslim students in Kolkata. And he uses a couplet to emphasize this feeling. He says, "Where man to man the world over shall brothers be," and that. And that is a line which, of course, if you realize, anybody realize that line? Who that is from? That's actually from the Scottish poet Robert Burns, right? So once again, the pre-romantic poet. Therefore, what I'm trying to emphasize is this equality that cuts across religion and ethnicity or race is a phenomenon that Derozio embraces. I have, of course, talked about the major influences: Hume, Tom Paine, Shelley, Keats, and Byron. Now, you can understand Hume, Paine, Shelley, Keats, and Byron, I guess. But Thomas Paine was a very interesting philosopher in the sense that he was largely banned in India and England because he was speaking against monarchy. He was speaking about the revolution. And somehow, from America, 1,000 copies of Tom Paine's Rights of Man came across to India. And Thomas Paine became a philosopher to whom the young Bengal gravitated, much to the consternation of the people, of the British rulers as such. You see, the problem here with the panel of philosophers that Derozio is looking at and teaching his students is that Christians were aghast that Derozio was preaching about skepticism on religion. You will remember that the most important figures in Calcutta at this point of time are all Christian missionaries, right? So for them, Derozio's teachings are an anathema because it's against Christianity. And of course, Derozio was preaching against Hindu dogmatism. He was speaking about the inefficacy of Hindu rituals, about the Brahmins and their oppression. He was talking against sati and the oppression against women. And very importantly, he was talking about wine and beef, two subjects which were almost, not almost, surely taboo for Hindu students. In fact, so engrossed were the students that they started eating beef, in fact, throwing beef in certain houses. And this generated an immediate outcry in the Hindu society. And many of Derozio's Young Bengal movement actually sort of were radical thinkers and practitioners. And therefore, both conservative Christians rose against Derozio, and of course, conservative Hindu society sort of wanted him to be publicly taken out from Hindu college at this point of time. But let me come to that a little later on. I have talked about the self-formation of Derozio, and therefore Drummond School becomes an important part. In fact, Drummond was to, after Derozio died, and Derozio was continuously being criticized in the public sphere in print culture, Drummond stood up for him and wrote several articles trying to justify Derozio's conduct and arguing the charges of atheism that were leveled against him. 1823, Derozio's father passes away. Derozio, if you notice, is just 14 years old, and he has to leave his school and go and look for a job. He initially joins his father's office in Kolkata and then shifts to his uncle's indigo factory in Bhagalpur. Now, Bhagalpur is a landmark in Derozio's life, really, because on the banks of the river Ganges, he looks after the indigo factory and he admires the beauty and the ruins of the Indian, the ruins of the great Indian Raj Mahal here. And of course, he looks at the picturesque territory across the Ganges and the island of Janghira, an island where you had a group of fakirs who lived on a rocky island which had no other habitation, as it were. And this wildness in the Ganges, the wildness in the topography, and this sense of isolation, natural beauty, immediately, and you will of course realize, ideas of the sublime that provoke him to composing several poems written in imitation of the Romantics. And the Romantics, if you remember, were greatly engaged in writing Oriental tales at this point of time, especially Byron, right? Lalla Rookh, for example, was being written at this point of time. And there was a general interest in the Orient, especially India, and the kind of wildness, sublimity, and an ancient civilization that India possessed. And Derozio was to look at these ruins and this wildness and start his own poetic career. And he started sending poems to the India Gazette. And at that point of time, the India Gazette paid 4 rupees for a poem. Interesting, isn't it? 4 rupees for a poem. And many of Derozio's poems were being published. What this meant was that Derozio was rising meteorically in fame in contemporary literary Kolkata. And you will remember that contemporary literary Kolkata had largely English poets taken from the Europeans who resided in Kolkata, right? It didn't have an Anglo-Indian poet in that sense. It didn't have an Indian poet, right? Therefore, Derozio was fast making his name as the first Indian to write effectively in a European register based in Kolkata, right? And that is why Derozio's identity as an Indian poet was fast developing. He's still very young, isn't he? Right. And in 1827, the editor of India Gazette, John Grant, takes notice of his poetry, offering to publish a book of his work and invites him to return to Kolkata. And this is also a turning point, because if Bhagalpur initiated him into an Orientalist mode of poetry, predominantly romantic, written in an European register, he's coming back to Kolkata and becoming the center of the young Bengal circle. Is also, this is the time when he's most prolific in that sense. He's publishing major poems, editing, helping Grant in editing the Calcutta Gazette. Now, when we look at Derozio, of course, you will find that we admire him as a poet, but we'll also take a look at his role in the print sphere in Kolkata at this point of time, especially the public print sphere. Derozio was not only editing journals, publishing periodicals. Many of his disciples, as it were, the young Bengal, were also publicly engaged in using print as a medium of change. Now, you will remember the role played by several periodicals of this period in shaping public opinion against dogmatism and change. Right. A later name who will come to the forefront will be Shatchandra Vidyasagar, of course. But Derozio's role in this public sphere, public print sphere, becomes very critical, and it becomes possible because he returns to Kolkata at this point of time. By the by, the pen name that he uses for the Calcutta Gazette is, for the India Gazette, I'm sorry, is Juvenis. So once again, a kind of name which is derived from a classical source, Juvenal, and a very public role of the poet, right? Now, 1827, his first collection of poems is published. In 1828. He's appointed professor of English and history at Hindu College, right? And the Fakir of Jangira and other poems is also published. Now, this is a new Derozio. As I said, young professor. He was appointed primarily because nobody agreed to teach at that low rate, and he knew he was making his name as an English poet. So the board at Hindu College thought that it would be useful to have Derozio teaching the students. How was this board comprised of the Hindu College? It comprised of members of the conservative Hindu families who had donated to make this college possible, especially Radhakanta Dev, very conservative Hindu, and the other half was from the European segment of the government, which had its own nominee on the board, and prominent Europeans, including David Hare, right? You will remember David Hare's role in spreading English education, Hare's school, and the people, the young boys who fought and ran behind David Hare's palanquin, palki, to get admission into his school. Hare was a very important figure in this period of for literary Kolkata, also education, especially English education through the Hindu College. Now, Derozio not only teaches, he also organizes debates among his students, encourages free thinking, and starts this association called the Academic Association. Now, it is impossible probably for you to think of the impact that Derozio had as a teacher. Now, he became the center around whom some of the brightest minds in Kolkata congregated, and I'll come to the members and their impact on Indian society a little later. And he's being, at this point of time, he's being encouraged also by David Hare. One of the major reasons being that he's speaking out against Hindu dogmatism. Now, what was Derozio's, dictum to his students. And this is something which I take from Rudrangshu Mukherjee. Derozio emphasizes that students should think for themselves. This was their sacred duty. The exchange of ideas, and everyone should express clearly what they felt. Encourages students to read books that they would not have read as part of the curriculum. Therefore, Tom Paine, which is banned in the syllabus, but which Derozio nevertheless asks his students to read. And very importantly, the importance of truth and virtue, and also that teaching is carried on beyond class hours in his own residence. Now, Presidency College or Hindu College becomes, it is impossible to teach all these ideas at college. So he invites his students back home. And his residence at Enterley becomes one of the most prominent areas in which this free-thinking, radical group of people, of young people, start congregating. And it is here, I would say, that he is bringing around himself, or he's creating around himself, a kernel of radicalism, as it were, many of which ideas went into the making of the Bengal Renaissance. So ideas about women's education, ideas about independence, ideas about against imperialism, ideas against Hindu dogmatism, ideas against idol worship, ideas about beef eating, ideas about drinking are being radically overhauled by Derozio at these meetings. Milton, Homer, and Shakespeare were, of course, part of Derozio's curriculum at Hindu College, but he tried to encourage his students to read Voltaire, once again, freedom, Kant, this question of freedom from dogma. If you remember, I'll be discussing the Enlightenment with you, Kant's dictum that the Enlightenment's motto is sapere aude, dare to know. Tom Paine and the Romantic poets of England, especially Shelley, right? And encouraged by Derozio, students try to speak out against Hindu practices, especially refusal to wear the sacred thread, opposing idolatry, and consuming beef, right? And therefore, there is a tremendous outrage among the Kolkata's Bhadraloks. Now, the Hindu community has already given money for the Hindu college, so they bring a charge against Derozio. What are these charges? There are three fundamental charges. That one, he encourages atheism. Two, that he encourages students to speak out against their parents and defy them. And three, that Derozio is indulging or encouraging in sodomy and incest. So these are the three charges which are framed against Derozio. This is what Radhakanta Deb wrote to the principal. It has been reported to me from time to time that the conduct of some of the adult students of the college is in the highest degree disorderly and irregular, and in various modes inconsistent with laws and usages of our caste, that in direct contradiction to its dictates, they eat and drink prohibited articles with Mohammedans and Christians, right? Some of these debates, of course, are coming back in a very big way in our societies as well, what we eat and what we drink. But at this point of time, the Hindu conservative segment is tremendously loaded against Derozio. And at this point of time also, what we can say is some of the students did go overboard, throwing beef at Hindu houses, announcing, in probably a religious ritual. In fact, one of the Derozians quoted Homer rather than uttering mantras. So it was a time when the Young Bengal movement actually moved headlong into conflict with conservatism. So it was a radicalism of a very different order. Now, and Derozio is called for, the charge is laid against Derozio. Interestingly, Derozio is not even given a chance to defend himself. The board decides that Derozio will be expelled from college and he has to resign. Only David Hare, one Hindu personality and another European member refuse to vote. The others all agree that Derozio should be sacked from college. Right. Now I will come to the question of the young Bengal a little later on. Let me just run through Derozio's life. Young Bengal will be the subject of a separate discussion. But who were these young Bengal personalities? Krishna Mohan Banerjee, author and converted to Christianity. Shib Chandra Deb, who would become a deputy collector later on and a major figure of the Brahmo Samaj. Horachandra Ghosh, later on to become a judge of the Calcutta Small Causes Court. Ram Gopal Ghosh, known as the Indian Demosthenes. Ramtanu Lahiri, major teacher and reformer. Many of you, of course, have read Shivnath Shastri's Ramtanu Lahiri or Tatkalin Maggo Samaj. Roshit Krishna Mullik, journalist, reformer, and educationist. Pieri Chand Mitra, very important figure of the period, writes Alaler Ghare Dolal, is a major novelist of the period, and starts this magazine called Ganan Nation, and is an important figure in also pleading for the independence of women. Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee, who in fact was allegedly throwing beef at people's houses. He was also later on the deputy collector of the Maharaja of Bardhaman. Radhanath Chikdar, a figure whom you know because he was instrumental in calculating the height of the Everest. So, very bright, sparkling figures, young figures, congregating around Derozio almost in the Guru Shishya Parampara, who treated Derozio as his guru, as their guru, and through Derozio was encouraged into free thinking, radical action, some of which went into the making of the Bengal Renaissance a little later. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that, encouraged by Derozio, a strange moment of modernity arrives in Kolkata at this point of time, a modernity which is fiery, which is radical, which challenges the dogmatic structure of society very intensely. At the same time, this is a modernity which practices extreme levels of rebellion. For example, drinking, whining, womanizing, beef eating becomes so rampant that they are ruthlessly mocked by not only conservative society, but also many Hindu reformers as well. For example, you have Michael Madhusudan Sekhi Ki Bole Shobbhota, you have Dinobandhu Mitra mocking the Young Bengal movement a little later on. So the Young Bengal is, once again, very, very complicated in its representation. On the one hand, people recognize the radicalism and change that they bring. On the other hand, this movement dies out very soon, and they are ruthlessly mocked for their excesses. But what they do is, at this point of time, within India, they usher in, or they force through, I'll not use the word usher. Usher has a very gentle meaning. They force through a modernity which interrogates very, very radically the dogmatic presence of both Hindu and Christian societies at this point of time. Some of the pictures, I'll come to the Young Bengal movement, don't worry, because I have a sonnet to discuss with you, and there I will discuss what the Young Bengal movement meant. Now, 1831, Derozio is dismissed for his post. 1828, remember, he's joined the college. So he's there just for 3 years. But within these 3 years, Derozio has become the center of Kolkata's controversies. 1831, he's dismissed. And 1831 literally dies with his leaving college. He's affected with cholera, and cholera being a disease that had little cure at this point of time, cholera rages within him, goes into a coma, and dies on 26 December at the age of 22, just 22. And there's the story which is spread that on his deathbed, he has acknowledged the presence of God and Christianity, which is hotly disputed by Drummond, because Drummond is there, and Drummond writes that this is absolutely false, that Derozio has never converted, as it were, to a more conservative Christian belief. After 1838, the Young Bengal movement establishes a second society called the Society for the Acquisition of General Knowledge. And this is chaired also by Hare. And it is from this society that we will see many of the features of the Bengal Renaissance moving into or coming into being. So my questions to you, after having taken you through the life and times of Derozio, these are the questions. What exactly is the contribution of the Young Bengal to Indian modernity? The question which we'll have to come back to again and again. How does Derozio emerge as the first nationalist poet of India? Now, it's not just merely because he's identifying himself with India and talking about himself as an East Indian. I forgot to mention that he had started the East Indian, which argued for the rights of the Anglo-Indians at this point of time. But not only does he talk about his identity as an Indian, he is also using the Indian topography for his poetry. He's using Indian locations. He's using Indian religion, social customs in a very big way. Say, when you talk about Fakir of Janghira, for example, you see Derozio talking about sati, about the relationship between Hindus and Muslims. He will be talking about the Hindu religion and the Brahmas. He will be talking about Surya. He'll be talking about Indian legends, including the legend of the Shashan, where he talks about the Betal Panchabhingshati, the Botri Shingashan, as it were, the legend of Bikramaditya and Betal. So he's using, within a predominantly European discourse or poetic idiom, is infusing an Indian content, is using an Indian register, and very importantly, many Indian words, vocabulary. Now, you see, when we talk about an Indian poetry in English, we are looking at also a way in which the language is indigenized, right? In which the registers of the Indian identities, Indian systems are being brought in. Now, you might, of course, argue that this is an Orientalist presentation, that Derozio is just borrowing what Byron is doing, and he's projecting India as this, dark, mysterious space, which is true to a certain extent. But unlike Byron, Derozio is familiar with the territory, is familiar with the customs, with the religion, and he's bringing in these idioms, this language, this register far substantially, and thereby creating a strange hybridity at this point of time, where you have a literature which is imitating the West, using the Orientalist perspective of the West, but infusing a degree of Indianness. And there is this harping on his identity as being an Indian, and talking about India's glorious past and its need to regenerate itself, represent itself in response to British occupation, and thereby stirring in a certain way the first seeds of nationalism in Indian poetry in English. So that is one area which we will look at. How does he emerge as the first nationalist poet of India, and the Orientalist elements in his poetry? And this other question that I will be discussing is this problematic response to sati, because Derozio's response to sati is not very uniform. He changes his position but that will be the substance of other classes. I've spoken far too long now, so let me round off what I have tried to do in this class. I have tried to give you an idea of a change in time, not only in India, but in Europe. A confluence of the Enlightenment deepening into the Romantic, where ideas of rationality, rebellion, political equality, challenge to authority and dogma are being transferred through English education into the generation of an Indian modernity. At the same time, to counter Hindu dogmatism, there is the need to defend this modernity through the Hindu Shastras. That is what Ram Mohan is doing. And later on, Vidyasagar will be following in the same light. What Derozio is doing is, he is bringing in this European modernity in all its fiery, radical force into Indian society, but restricted to a group of students within Hindu college. He's also introducing within the Oriental poetry about India a new register, a new language, a new familiarity with topography, and thereby initiating a poetry that is European in its technique, but somewhere the Indian sensibilities are filtering through. Also important is that he is announcing his identity as Indian, talking about a gorgeous, glorious Indian past and the need to regenerate that past into the present. Right. So on the one hand, let's say it's very complicated, isn't it? On the one hand, there is this effervescent nationalism that he's trying to bring in. On the other hand, there is this Orientalism that he's latching on to, that he's sort of also using in a very big way. There's, of course, this radicalism that he's trying to bring into society, and the role of the poet, the inculcation of the Young Bengal movement, and also in his poetry is trying to address contemporary issues in India, especially in Hindu society. So this is Derozio and his times. A kind of mercurial life, isn't it? 22 years, and within these 22 years, creating a furor within society, forcing Indian society to come face to face with European modernity, as it were, in a certain way. That is what I've tried to give you an idea about how Derozio's self-formation is quite directly superimposed upon the self-formation of Indian modernity at this point of time. And the one figure which you will have to perennially keep across your mind is Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Because when Raja Ram Mohan Roy, tries to organize, in fact, Raja Ram Mohan Roy is an important driver in the establishment of the Hindu college. But Radhakanta Dev and the others say, if Raja Ram Mohan Roy enters Hindu college and the board, then they will walk out. So here actually requests Raja Ram Mohan Roy to stay away, and Raja Ram Mohan stays away from Hindu college. Derozio enters Hindu college, but is shunted out from Hindu college. So we have two directions of reform, as it were, one in Raja Ram Mohan, one in Henry Louis Vivian Derozio. Two different streams, one which is fierce, which tries to sweep away everything in front of it and dies a very quick death. The other, which deepens, is slightly less radical and which carries on into the Bengal Renaissance. But both these traditions, both these modernist thinkers usher in an important role in what will be the deepening modernity of Bengal later on. Additionally, in Derozio's case, there is the poetic component to think about. Derozio is both poet and teacher, the prophet, as it were, who tries to inculcate this among his students. That then, ladies and gentlemen, is the life and times of Henry Louis Vivian Derozio. I will stop my recording at this point of time so that we can now take your discussions in the class. Right. So give me a moment to stop the recording.